Okay, a lot of people are going to start joining us for this awesome brown bag presentation with Dan Levy. So just sit tight. We're going to begin in just 1 minute. Thank you so much for being here, everyone.
Ryan, you're going to record this one, right?
We are recording now.
Wow.
So that was just recorded. So
perfect.
Yep, we got it taken care of. Okay, a lot of people are going to be trickling in. We'll just kind of get started because we want to be respectful of your time and Dan's time and everyone's time. Time is precious. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're really pleased to announce this amazing brown bag presentation from Dan Levy on high impact refactoring. So I'm just going to turn the time over to you, Dan, and take it away from here, my friend.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan. As noted, my name's Dan Levy. I'm a open source, probably over enthusiast. That's probably the right description. And I am a instructor of a couple years experience. And I'm here to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that's refactoring. And it's one of those things that let me go ahead and share my screen so you can see what I got here. Okay. Okay, did that come through?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so the key things that I want to focus on are, well, what is refactoring? Because it's a bit of a jargony word that I kind of kept at arm's length when I was starting out. And then I want to jump into one of the most high impact techniques that you can apply to almost any code base and do it with very little prior knowledge of the architecture. This is something that you can do at the very smallest parts of the code, and it really lets you understand and tease out functionality and improve readability. Like the key measure of that, or the rule of thumb I provide, is improve readability by reorganizing large functions, and I define that as 20 plus lines, into smaller logical functions of just 1 or 4 lines. Now, let's cover our first objective real quick. So the famous Martin Fowler has defined refactoring as change made to the internal structure of software to make it easier to understand and cheaper to modify without changing its observable behavior. Now, this is important, and it may seem like, well, wait, you're making changes and nothing can be observed? Well, that doesn't sound like anything people pay for. Well, it actually is about improving the readability of the code, the maintainability of your code long term. And really, it's an art. There's no one way to do this. There's no one reason to do this. However, today I'm going to be focusing on the readability. You may find people writing entire articles about doing refactoring for performance reasons or for any other of a number of reasons. So this is a very wide subject area. We're just going to focus on one of the more impactful techniques. So one of the things that I found a little hard to understand at first was the why. Why would I want to change internal structure of software, making it easier to understand, cheaper to modify? Don't people just argue about understandability anyway? I mean, is this really a discipline? Well, I want you to take a few minutes. So everyone on the call, I want you to put in the Slack channel for the brown bag channel I just joined. I want everyone to write at least 2 things that are reasons why you might want to refactor. Like, think back to your recent code that you maybe couldn't understand when you went back to it, or you went on a long weekend and came back and were like, who wrote this? Oh yeah, I wrote this. So if you've ever thought of that, this is a technique that can help that situation. So I want 2 reasons written out why you might want to refactor. And let me switch over to. So, see Dan Sherman's typing. Come on, where's everyone else at? I don't see many brown bags. So
there's a questions and answers thread that I posted. If you click on that, you'll be able to see some of the stuff that the students are writing.
Excellent. Carlos says easier to debug. Steven says minimize technical debt and can make it less of a cognitive load trying to get back in the mindset of how it all works. Those are excellent points. Like this is these are some of the lesser brought up points. A lot of times when I talk about this technique, the first thing people say is, "Oh, don't repeat yourself." Dry code is great, and I don't know if we've covered that, but these, yeah, and Peter just added if breaking into smaller functions, those are usually easier to test and reason about. That's exactly what we're going for. We're going for easier to understand code, and we're using the natural labeling of functions. They provide a label that describes the behavior, whereas comments and things like that can fall out of date. This provides a tighter link. And before I go rambling on about all these theories, it seems like we've got the reasons and the why. Let's go and apply this technique. So I'm going to demonstrate what I'm talking about and with some examples here. But basically, we're going to go through these 3 steps. Zoom in here, make sure you can see my screen. I'm going to find a large function. In this case, they're not going to be 20 lines for the sake of the demonstration. But generally, when you're looking at a code base, you want to find the larger functions. And what I do is I go through and I name the sub-steps. And that means that, if I'm checking arguments at the top, then I say, check arguments. Then after that, then I submit the data to the database. Okay, cool. Then after that, I then send off the response data to some other API. Okay, so then I've got 3 steps. Okay, those are all in English. Now I've got to extract them. So let me pull up the link. I've got a replit here somewhere. Okay, so can everyone see my REPL screen here? Excellent. Okay, so take a minute. This is actually not even 10 lines of code. We have less than 20, but the important thing is we want to extract these steps. We want to name what's going on here. And let's walk this through. So we have item prices. So we've got an array. It's got 3 numbers in there. We'd have a for loop, and it uses this number format thing to make it into a currency. It formats it, and then it seems to update the value in the array, and then it prints the array. So let's go ahead and write those out. So like I said, the first step is let's just say what these steps are. So the first one is getting a get list of prices. Then the next one is format currency. And so this is actually a kind of a simple one. And it doesn't, so let me show you like how I'm going to extract this behavior. So I'm going to look for the unique piece that is probably multi-line in here. So this format currency thing sticks out to me because it has multiple lines. And it uses this formatter with a bunch of config data passed into it that's hard-coded. Now, I don't know if that's always going to stay that way or whatever, but the important thing is I'd really like just a currency formatter that has these baked-in defaults and just takes a number and returns it. That way I don't have to figure out what this INTL number format thing is, because honestly, every time I see it, I have to look it up on on MDN and figure out, was it style currency or currency style? Anyway, so we're going to go ahead and make a function that's literally called format currency. And I'm going to extract this and say, and so like one of the nice things about doing this, even though this is really simple, what may happen is you may have had a bug in your code that one of those numbers wasn't a number and you were getting an invalid result and you didn't know where the problem was. But it's easier to understand here that that we can actually just copy paste this into our console. Like I think one of the Slack replies mentioned, this is actually now easy to test. I can copy paste this and put this anywhere, feed in data and see what happens. It's an easy, cheap smoke test. So that's one of the benefits I have of like pulling out these little bits of logic. But then what we got to do up here is remove those lines, and I'm not used to not having my IDE shortcuts here, so typing extra here. But so we now have the key piece here. So we already basically have a list of prices. It's hard-coded here. Now we have this for loop, and we can probably even get rid of this temp variable altogether. So now our for loop focuses on just the task at hand. We got rid of a temp variable. We got rid of this number formatter browser interface. We extracted all that, and now our code is a much more concise and focused version of what we had before. Are there any questions on this process? Okay, cool. I don't see anything on the QA thread, but let me just recap on what the reasons why that were posted earlier. Would you agree that this is a thing that makes it easier to debug? Thanks, Sam. So, excellent. These are fantastic things. So, Stephen brought up a question about array.map, and that is a fantastic example. I will leave to you to refactor, and in fact, you'll find that this is going to be even really like, it'll be even easier to refactor once you've got single-purpose little functions. They plug right into your map, or find, or filter, or whatever. So definitely go. I'll leave that as homework. But for Stephen, you said more concise, yes, but also more code now. So this is a very good point. So it's more concise here, and because there's always trade-offs. We're always balancing trade-offs one way or another. But what I did was I prioritized the naming of functions as labels to describe the behavior. So this loop before, had 3 lines. It involved a temp variable and a couple other things that, to me, are just noise. They distract from what we're getting at. And usually it's only easy to see that stuff after you've written out the first version. So that's why I usually describe this as a refactor technique. But the more code, I would say if I end up with just 5% more code, and in that case I was not able to eliminate any repetitive code, if my code increases just 5% in exchange for 50% more readability and testability, so that when I can verify how this format currency behaves, I give it a non-number, I can give it different numbers, I can give it numbers with lots of decimal places. I can fully verify how this format currency works in isolation. And being able to easily test and assert that your code works the way it's expected is much easier with this sort of a technique. So the trade-offs and the benefits, it's not a one like there's no one way to do it, but I'd say that, to me, this is a much a really good trade-off when all things are considered. Yeah, and Ken notes that indeed that it can be reused in multiple places if needed. So reuse is a huge part of it, but it's just something that everyone else talks about a lot when refactoring. Like there's a common statement that says, don't repeat yourself. It's about making it so your code doesn't have repetitive bits of logic in there. And just because it's so overly focused on, I don't want it to be the main reason. Because sometimes people take that to the extreme and say, well, if this isn't being repeated, well, I don't need to refactor it because it's not. The reason to refactor it is about before it even you see a repeated bit of code, you want to extract logic and you want to make it so that your 20, 30 line functions or more are easier to understand. Like I can't remember a time I spent 6 months or 3 months away from a code base and came back to code that I wrote and could remember very well if I've got dozens and dozens of lines in there. I have to actually go and parse what I was doing, re-understand every little thing, and it's not that I can't. It's just that it takes more time to refamiliarize myself. But if there's small little functions that, if I'm not sure how currency format works, or if I was expecting euros or pounds to come out of this, well, cool. If I copy paste that into my console, and go ahead and just do the paste it in here, format currency. We can go ahead and see like what happens when you put in all these different values. And it's a really cheap way to do it. But if I had this, if the data was tied into a database call, it'd be actually kind of hard to pull in, to just paste this in your dev tool or your Chrome console. So it's about like extracting the logical steps into functions that accept arguments and return their result. Excellent comments going on here, guys. Really, Harrison, nice Java snippet in here. Sorry, it's all like line wrapping in my view here, but I'll check it out in a sec. So let's go and let me jump into the next example. So here, this is so I wanted to give you guys a very singular update. Can you see my kitten filtering here? Yep, Michael, I see your comment here. Exactly, it is easier to write tests. And that is, it actually made it so my testing game is easier now. I don't fight writing tests anymore. It's actually a joy to write once you've extracted these methods because they're easier to understand. You're not toiling away for hours trying to figure out how 20 layers of code manage to get to a broken spot. Well, I don't want to, I'm a few minutes behind where I wanted to be. I wanted to get this assignment, so I'm going to Slack out this link right here. I want you to, or actually, I want you to see if you can spot the steps in here. So this is kind of one that's maybe a little too simple. And I don't know who mentioned the map, could use map. Well, this similarly uses filter, another array method. But let's see if we can write the steps here. So for this one, I want you to write in the QA thread at least 2 steps, because this has got, basically 2 steps. So go ahead, type in that in the thread. I want to see at least 1 or 2 steps, just name them. I want human words. And I'll pull 1 minute on the clock for that. Excellent, Sam. Excellent, Peter. Peter, excellent. So I want you to notice how everyone kind of approaches this differently. If you notice in the channel, everyone, associates different words in English to when they're trying to understand code. And similarly, they'll often write the code differently. That's part of why I chose such a short example here. That even when you're just talking a few lines of code, it's very easy to disagree, or not disagree, but to come up with different descriptions of what's going on here. So just imagine how this gets compounded when you have 20, 30, 40, or 50 lines of code. Things can really, you could really start just disagreeing on the fundamental understanding of your code between team members. So that should kind of be your warning flag of, is this code really well understood or written as well as it could be? So as Peter noted here, like this, take a second to compare Peter Murphy's example here, or description. He says, filter cats under evil threshold and return the first good cat. So that describes at the level I would look for. Not to say that's right or anything, but here's why. So the next step is taking these descriptions and turning them into functions if possible. So that first one, filter cats under evil threshold. Well, I can say function is under is not evil. And then I can say cat, and then I just return a cat.evil and say okay, so if my cat's evil score is under 50, this little helper can be just dropped in right here. And in fact, I probably could have reused a const error function, just cut that out directly. So like usually I try to minimize code changes when I'm extracting my logic. So I named my steps. I stole Peter Murphy's naming. Instead of saying under the threshold, I just said is not evil. There may be cases where you want to be able to customize the threshold, but because that's not in the example or not specified, we don't need to code that doesn't need to be coded. And so now that this is a more, and you notice that last step, that the return the first good cat. Well, now it may be a little simpler to see or easier to see that that filter might not be the best array method to use here. And if you are unfamiliar with it, find on MDN is very similar to, or if you read the docs for find on MDN, it works very similarly to filter, except it returns a single item, the first thing to match. So now find good cat, which just accepts cats, .find, is not evil. So reading this code and just the words in it, if you blur your eyes a little bit, and it kind of seems like Peter Murphy's description is almost the exact same words I put into code here. So that's kind of like by extracting these like entangled bits of logic, you're adding more meaning and using descriptive words that are a little easier for our human brains to process. And so whether or not is not evil is reusable, or it may or may not have purpose outside of this class or in this game, the reusability is, to me, a bonus, because after the fact, because I wrote this function this way, I know I can reuse it later. There is no shared state. Like, it's reusable, period, because of the way I extracted it. So let's go and I was going to do this. This is a far more complicated example that I meant to do first. So actually, this is probably a great example. So let me just talk you through at a high level what we're doing here. So I won't, we can kind of do this together. I don't want to just dump you with something that's like 5 times harder than what we just did. But let me go and just walk you through what we're doing here. So this is a nested Ajax call, and I love it. Okay, let me share this link out. I don't usually try to warm me up to something this complicated. I don't want to just go from a single method extracted, is my cat evil, to, hey, nested JSON, let's do this. So let's go through this. Nonetheless, like, you may find yourself looking at complex code in the future. The important thing is, like, let's try and spell out what this is doing. So I put in here a link to the My Profile results on GitHub. So if you pull up this page here, you'll notice this is the GitHub API result for my user. Now, the organization's URL, so what we're doing in this code is, close out of that one. So get user orgs. Well, that means I'm getting the user, and then I'm getting their organizations. So we see in here, there's a organizations URL. Aha, I remember seeing that over here. So in order to get the organizations, I can't just make one query. GitHub makes you do successive queries. Now it's not quite REST, and it's a little out of scope in this lesson to get into the details on why they do this. But the important thing is, you'll find these kinds of situations where you want to get get some secondary data from an API call, or you do a query on Google Maps and then you want to find local restaurants around that geolocation. So there's many situations where this will happen where, hey, I've got this one bit of data and I need to go 2 steps to get this other piece. So basically, the short version is, we get the user, we check to make sure they have an organization URL, which I don't know that wouldn't ever, or could be missing, but I put in a little safety handler here to just say, hey, if there's no user or organization, just throw a warning, throw an error. And and then I just feed in that organization URL straight into the fetch API, and then I get those organizations. It looks like I'm also extracting just the login name. So this is a lot of tightly wound stuff here. Let's go here. So login, we've got our some of the teams I'm on. So here so let's go and describe these steps. Okay, so again, I want to see you put them in the brown bag thread. There may be 3 or 4 to this one, but let's list some steps. What are we doing at a high level that describes what each of the sub steps in this process are? Go ahead, start punching that out. I'm going to put 2 minutes on the clock. Yep. Hey, Peter. Yep, I'm in Colorado. So, and here's a hint. This function name here, get user orgs, I mean, it's 3 words that kind of describe, at least to me, 3 of the steps. Hey, Cameron, you saw my talk at the Node.js meetup. Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad I got my fan club to show up. I appreciate it. I've got some upcoming talks that I'll be putting on my blog, blog and Twitter in the coming days. I've got an April and June thing at Node. Excellent, excellent, Michael. Good job getting granular there. And okay, I see. Okay, I see. Harrison noted that if you don't have, I think you need to have public orgs enabled on your profile before they'll show up in the API. So if you're not seeing them for you, that might be why. So Stephen, given username, query an API, convert to JSON. So I see we get a couple of these steps include parsing JSON. So I'm going to say like that is part of the get piece here. So I'm going to go ahead and write out my steps like I tried to do in just a comment block. So 1, get some an Ajax data or get Ajax endpoint. 2, kind of paraphrase some of the steps I see here. So web user and orgs, and then excellent. Oh, Camry, nice, excellent names there. So yeah, get username, get validate, get organizations, get logins. Hey, I can tell you have seen my talks. Oh, warms my heart. So excellent, Kat. That's what I'm looking for. So yeah, it's yeah, Michael. That's such a good point. It's so cool how everyone comes up with different explanations for the steps, but at a certain level, like we're almost figuring out how far down we break apart the logic. Like at a certain level, we could keep going and explain how the response.json like deals with different data. We could go really deep onto any of these little aspects. Like, if we're dealing with an API that may return non-JSON and we need to check it, or errors may come down in non-JSON. Well then, there's this whole other complexity. But right now we don't have to deal with any of that. We're just, everyone here is focused really tightly on what's presented, and even within that, on these examples that are just a few lines, there's many ways we all describe the same thing. So keep that in mind when you're doing pair programming sessions or when you're doing code reviews. It's really easy to talk past someone when you're really talking about the same thing or very, 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 very close. Excellent points being brought up in the chat. So let me, so this last step, yeah, we're pulling out the login, which is, I guess, the organization name. I didn't see any other human names and human-friendly names. So cool. So let's take a look at building this out. So if we've got a get Ajax. So the reason I put get Ajax as its own little thing is because we've got 2 bits of code. I see several people mention there's multiple JSON parsings. So if I go here and take this out to say, I just want to get request that automatically converts to JSON. So I'm going to say const get JSON equals so now I've eliminated two of the repetitious function names here. So if I just say get JSON, okay. So, and it's important to implement these changes one by one. So all I did is replace this get the fetch call so that it auto JSON extracts it, and we're building up to some fancy composition. Thanks for so here with our this inner method here. So we've got this function here that accepts a user from our user's API request, and we want to let's extract that out. So I'm going to actually cut that out because it was because I can just take that whole thing out and then call it, say, const get or okay. And basically I can keep doing this. So now my get user orgs is just a get JSON call, calls that API, and then gets the organizations. But even still, I still can extract this one method here. And I would be testing this live, but I realized I overdid I hit API limits on GitHub right before doing this and was getting errors. You know, of course, this happens right before you do a lesson. So my instructions to keep testing as you go are only accepted in this case where my GitHub API requests are currently 429ing. So so right now is where I test the get organizations extracted method here. But there's this other piece here, extract the display login, or just extract the login method, the key here, if I can talk. So given a list of organizations, I want to just return an array of logins. So again, I'm going to cut that value out and just say, maybe call it org logins, because it's going to take a okay. Again, if you mentioned the, we can probably get rid of the return here because this is pretty tiny. Okay, so we could extract the checks here, and oftentimes I do. But as you can see, like this is something that you can apply as you go. Sometimes things get messy in the middle of the process. And the important things to note are that as you keep extracting, like things can get better, but you always want to ask yourself, is this really improving? Am I adding clarity? Keep in mind what your objective and your goal is when you're doing this. But I've never run into a situation where well-named tiny functions made code harder to read. It usually is only the case if they're elaborately used and put together in bizarre ways. As you can tell, functional composition is kind of my jam. So glad to hear that. As you can see, this is just one way to break this stuff down. I have another version this is something I was working on earlier, where I gave specific names to each of the steps, like get user, get orgs, but get orgs takes a user. And I wasn't sure that this was quite clear that each of these, because get user, you can just work pass that data in. Get orgs requires, it's dependent on a user being passed in. So I don't know if this helped, if the naming here I thought maybe implied too much or implied that they were used in a similar way. But again, like that isn't, I didn't want to spend too much time dwelling on that or figuring out what the best way to name it. The key thing is that I have these isolated, reproducible steps that I can just pass dummy data in and see how they work. I can make sure that if I pass a user without an organization URL, I get the expected error. So excellent. So I want to pause real quick and make sure that we've actually covered some of these objectives. So I hope everyone here has actually had some chance to go through that link that I shared and can actually, we've got some practice going through naming the steps. So we didn't actually have a 20-line function because that is kind of out of the scope. That would probably take over an hour to like do in a group setting. But I want you to take this in mind when you're looking at your code or doing a peer review. Find large functions and then see if you can extract main functions. Even if you don't like do all the steps, it's a good exercise to practice in your head, because then you're starting to familiarize, like not just modeling what the code does, but also explaining it to the humans or explaining to the muggles, as I say. There's as you noted, everyone describes this stuff differently. Going through those reps, going through those exercises, being mindful of that stuff at a higher level really will make you an effective team member, effective reviewer, contributor. It really will have to pay dividends in all sorts of areas. So the key takeaway is being able to find the large functions, which shouldn't be hard, naming the sub-steps, which we got some exercises doing in the channel, and extracting the logic. We saw how to do it inside a for loop. Then we saw how to do it with array methods and some composition. And then we did it again with a nested Ajax. So this technique can handle really complex async code. It can handle really simple code that's deceptively simple, or maybe just needs some clarification. So this technique really does apply across the board. So excellent. Yes, Kat, that's exactly the point. That's so I removed temporary variables in the process. So and since they die with the function anyway, that's a really dramatic way to put it. But yeah, they if they aren't hoisted out, they are garbage collected away once they fall out of scope. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to say, hey, function names are a better label of what's going on. Variable names tend to just be things, and they tend to often be generalized versions, or they don't convey much purpose. They don't tell you the why or what's going on. And more often than not, they're misleading. Like one person may choose one naming scheme, another may choose another, as we see people differ on naming. These things really create more noise. So by focusing on a function name as the meaningful point, context for what's going on, stringing them together, you can use array methods, you can use promises, you can just wrap your methods in just a bunch of parentheses. Like there's many ways to compose these functions, but once you prioritize tiny functions over just a mess of like delicately woven code with lots of temp variables, it's a lot easier to isolate and identify the behavior and that it's behaving correctly. And that, when you get an error from it, your stack trace will actually have a useful name that describes what was, format number through an error. Oh, it's because I gave it a string. Okay. Instead of, check user before checkout. Okay, well, that may be a deceptively long name for a function that seems like it may do that. But if that's a 100-line function that does all these things, that checks the subtotals and generates a balance and a receipt, there's too much going on there to verify for sure that it's going to work. Extracting things out and making it so you've got clearly labeled functions helps on many fronts, not just readability, but the debug messages you get makes it easier to jump with context to the right place. Reading a stack trace that actually lists the named functions, like, reverse order, telling you where your error came from, is a delight. Like, you suddenly can lose all those anonymous references and things in the stack trace that make them kind of scary to newbies and make them a little intimidating when, if nothing has names in there and you just have like references to library code, it can be really daunting. But suddenly, if your name function labels come through, it's suddenly like looking at a mountain and seeing all the handholds that you can climb. Like, it's a different feel, but it's something you'll kind of see as you go. Are there any other questions? I don't want to blow over our time limit here. I see Sam's. Are you following a specific set of guidelines with regard to when you're using function declarations and arrow functions? No, that's, I've been having a discussion on Twitter with Kyle Simpson about the virtue of arrow functions, so I don't know if that's been, I have complex thoughts on the matter. It's probably out of scope for this. Yeah. Yep, it sounds like a potential blog post indeed. I don't know if I want to wade into that fight on arrow functions. I'll let Kyle Simpson fight that fight. And,
let me know when there's a venue to watch that fight. I'll take ringside tickets, please.
Have you heard of Reddit? I think.
Okay. We don't need to get Reddit involved.
I think it's a built-in platform for arguing.
280 characters, right? Okay, cool. Wow, Dan, this was amazing. It looks like questions are winding down. So I was just going to ask you one question that I had, and it revolves around just kind of a piece of advice. Like, what would you say to these learners that are here today, to this audience, is the most important thing that they can take with them as they break into this industry from their previous whatever it was that they were doing?
So, sorry, I cut out there for a second. So what is the most important takeaway?
Yes. What's the most important thing that these students can take with them as they're trying to break into the industry? Whether it's, maybe this ability to refactor a code base or whatever, like, what's the most important thing in your head, or one of the most important things that these students need to break in and signal and make it work?
Great question. So one of the nice things about this technique is it is a refactor technique. I don't ever write my code off the first time like this, but where this can be deployed is in doing open source contributions. Like, you can actually, so if you're looking to break in the industry and really show that you have proficiency on a library you use, maybe a React Router, React Native, whatever it is, if you want to show proficiency in that. So sometimes you can use this technique just to make the examples or the documentation on one of these projects more easy to read. Sometimes they'll have like a real world example with a bunch of, foo bar, variable names, things that are just not that beginner friendly, and maybe an expert can see through it. But being able to take this technique and then reapply it so that, this is the part in the React Router where it loads the auth helpers or whatever it is, like being able to use this and then offer it as a pull request or an open source contribution really demonstrates that you understand deeply the code, that you understand deeply what the goals that the project's trying to convey, and you also get a free ticket to meet the contributors and project organizers. Like one of the best networking things for me, one of the biggest potentiators from my career has been getting involved in open source. And there's many ways to do that. One of them is doing code or documentation contributions. So using this technique either on examples that are provided. Most examples in projects or reference examples are very difficult to understand when they're like full projects. Like, it's one thing when you're just looking at a little block of code, but when the scope gets bigger, even the best projects have trouble maintaining that, or even finding the time to refactor. I should probably put it that way. So by going through and making the code examples a little easier to apply or more modular, it makes them easier for other people, future developers, to go and apply that code in their own code base because it's less tightly coupled and wound up in their prior opinions. So breaking things up, it enables people to more rapidly adopt the code. It makes so people can more easily understand it. All these things align with a lot of open source projects. They want people to be able to start quickly, contribute easily, and understand how to use it. So this is a really good way to make sure that when an employer is looking at a stack of resumes and they just have a bunch of juniors and everyone they think is a junior, whether or not, whatever that label means, this is a great way to set yourself apart by showing how much you care about the community, care to contribute to things selflessly or for the betterment of other developers. These are traits that will stand out as things that are a hiring manager or a savvy one knows that they want that on their team.
Radical. Peter, we'll have these last two questions, or the last question and then a comment. Peter mentioned, why did you choose the specific libraries that you contributed to?
So some of them were just a opportunity, like I found a bug or I found something frustrating. And I got to the point where, I made a workaround and I realized, I've been using this workaround for ages when it would actually be easier just to simply fix the original code. And then it's just, I added a class name here. It didn't radically change the project and it may have taken some selling to the project owner. But once I could explain the scenario and the use case, and it's like, okay, cool. So it's an easy thing to sell sometimes. Other times, like it's been things that are, I found out from teaching. I'd teach a lesson on React Router, for example, and I found out people were getting really bizarre examples and they were getting confused like all the time. And I found out it's because their homepage and their default examples were really confusing. Google would direct you to a philosophy page and it gave you like 4 examples of router patterns, none of which were React Router. It gave you like an Angular one, a Ember one, an Express one even. So, and sure, that may be valuable in a philosophy context. But when I was teaching lessons and I was actually able to observe people like staring at that, like thinking, what am I even looking at? It was like, it's not that the docs are broken. It's just that people are landing on the wrong homepage. So sometimes just being close to a problem enables you to see tiny little high impact changes. Like I literally made a 1-line change in the React Router docs that changed their homepage. So it's like, I'm not claiming I'm the contributor or I invented it or anything. I'm saying I was able to deploy my skills to make 1-line change in their docs so that the homepage now includes examples that are copy pastable, that are usable, that one might expect from an open source project. And so it really varies on the situation. But usually it's going to be projects that you've used and are familiar with, or the ones that you aren't. If you're struggling with a project, that's a great point to be like, why am I struggling? Is it me or is it the code? Or is this written to a level that I can understand? And maybe in that case, more often than not, you're uniquely positioned to find what's missing. Sometimes you just need to get find those other resources or examples on Google like you would anyway. But instead of just taking that solution and going off on your work and saying, okay, I'm done. Let me just, whatever, those docs sucked. I figured out my own solution. Instead of just kind of dusting that problem under the rug, it's an interesting habit when you start saying, hey, wait, I found a gap in the context there in the guide there. Let me go back and put a pin in it so that I can actually provide with the context that I had, that was missing for me. Sorry, I'm kind of, this is the subject of my next talk at the Node.js meetup in April, on like the how to find the things to open source, to work on for open source. So that will be live streamed, and I can share a link with these guys.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much. And yeah, so if you, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just noticed I thought Harrison was asking if I work on Go and Rust open source projects.
Yeah, it looks like Harrison's a Rust and Go fanboy. So
Rust and Go are awesome. The Go community around Docker, I found very welcoming. They welcomed me like just in full embrace. I made some of the best relationships and networking opportunities just offering basically broken Go and shellcode to Docker, and then it got swarmed, and they all came to help me and be like, oh no, Dan, this is how this is really supposed to work. And in far more effort than it would have taken them to just fix my broken stuff, everyone went and helped me understand what was going on, understand how to contribute to the project. So really check out Docker, or if you're looking for a high impact, high visibility project to contribute some Go or hardcore code to, that's a really welcoming community.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for joining us. We're a little bit over time, so we really, really appreciate you taking the time to come out and share some thoughts. And yeah, we look forward to hearing from you, hopefully in the future.
Excellent. Thanks. Look forward. Really appreciate it.
Get back to work, student. No, I'm just kidding. See you later.